All right, so I'll get going. Good morning, guys. Dan Gordon from Flash Fire here. This is the second of four installments of this class for you guys. So if you already sat through it, I apologize. Hopefully we'll pick something else, up from it this time. But basically, it went about an hour, 15 minutes last time. I'm going to go through the PowerPoint on meters in general, the sensors, how they work, things like that. A little bit of interpretation of them. It's not a tactics class. And then what I'll do is I'll pull out the Draeger meters that you guys have. I'll run through those quickly. Obviously, answer any questions you have. So there's that chat window. Feel free to either put something into that or, just interrupt me, raise your hand, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's a small group, so pretty easy to go. But most important thing, any questions you have, let me know. So metering for the fire service, not the class you want, but the class you need. And I kind of dubbed it that. And some of the classes I make are not always the classes that you want, but sometimes, there's a need in the fire service to kind of, some of this stuff that's not trained on as much as it maybe should be. And it's a lot of times stuff we use every day. So meters, we're taking them out every day for CO calls or whatever the case may be. So I want to make sure that you guys are operating them properly, keeping your guys safe, and obviously the public as well. All right, so why this class? Meters are more than just turning them on and off. How many times have you ever heard someone say for a gas call, I have 0 parts per million on the Ldl sensor, or, using the CO meter to meter for a gas call, things like that, just make my hair stand up as number one. Why have we not done a better job educating on this? And number two, obviously that person has no idea what they're doing, and they could potentially be in a dangerous environment and not even realize it. On the purchasing side, which we're not going to get into today because obviously you guys, that's not what this class is for, but a lot of departments want one meter that can do everything. And so I kind of put this class together also to kind of educate on the purchasing side of it. When we get to those slides, we'll kind of, we won't really touch on those at all. These meters protect us. Many of the issues are user error, and not necessarily user error in that we did something wrong, but it's something that we can fix very easily. So you don't always need to take the meter out of service, call the salesman, whatever. That said, you're more than welcome to reach out to me anytime if you have any questions. Again, not a tactics-based class. We're really just talking about meters today. We're not going to be doing obviously any suits or decon or anything beyond meters and how they work. All right, I put this together as kind of half a joke. Where are you on the meter scale? I think most people are here, hopefully. You hate hazmat, but it's our job. We want to be good at it. We don't need to love hazmat. I don't love doing EMS, but it's my job, so I do want to be good at it. So that's kind of why, where I want guys to be. All right, so we'll go through this stuff as we get in this morning. So meters in the fire service. What are we seeing in the fire service? Oh, sorry, no audio. What do we got? Hold on 1 second. Test. Are you guys muted? Can anyone else hear me or no?
I can hear you.
Okay, so the two guys that put in that they can't hear me, maybe your volume's muted or something. So let me know if you get it fixed. So I'll keep going. I am recording this, so if you guys need to watch it later, if you really have an issue, I'll put it up later. So meters in the fire service, what we're talking about here, the top, 3 layers or top 3 lines are kind of what we see and use on a daily basis. The single gas, the 4 gas, and the PID. And these can be obviously integrated together or, separated. Tubes and chips, more on the hazmat side of things. Hazmat team side of things, chemical agent and radiation meters, again, hazmat side of things. Mercury meters, not seeing too many of those, but we do have them out there. Refrigerants, refrigerant meters, leak meters. Well, that's something that you might run into even with like a maintenance crew or a service company or something like that. So you may run into those even if you don't necessarily have those in your arsenal. So single gas, multi-gas, PID, the single gas, obviously pretty obvious, used to detect a single gas. And you can get a meter for many gases out there. So if you have a specific need for, you guys have CO and HCN, but if you had a specific need for ammonia, chlorine, or, something like that, you could get a meter specifically for that. Multi-gas is obviously a lot of single gas combined. The range is, you can get a 2 gas up to an 8 gas. It displays all of those simultaneously, but they are individual sensors. So one does not correlate, or one does not talk to the other one, meaning that you'll get one reading on one sensor and it won't necessarily, though we will get into times where it does, affect another sensor. So, but it's going to display all of those readings simultaneously. And then the PID, the photoionization detector, we'll talk about that a lot today because that is a new meter to you guys. That's going to be carried on the training officer, training lieutenant, safety officer vehicle. It's a photoionization meter. It can be integrated into a multi-gas, which yours is, though you may run into them out there where it's a single gas. And it's useful. It will detect the presence of volatile organic compounds. And again, we will talk about that when we get into that specific sensor. Tubes and chips. This is probably the most common meter that a lot of fire departments do not carry, that hazmat companies do carry. And the reason is you either colorimetric tubes, which basically specific gas, you draw the gas in and it gives you an indicator based on the color, what level you have. Chips is a quantitative display, so actual numbers up there. The advantages with these is a variety of different gases. You don't need to calibrate it. So you can get over 200 tubes based on what you're reading. And then less cross sensitivities too. So you're not going to get false readings with these as much. Terrorism meters, probably not something you carry. These kind of came in obviously after 9/11. What was happening a lot of times was the radiation meters were being given to PD with no training. Hey, if this goes off, call the fire department. Meanwhile, the fire department had no training or any, advanced metering capability above this. So, we were seeing where cops were pulling people over. These were going off, and they were coming from, not MRI, but stress test treatment or something where they got radiation inserted in them. And obviously, no one had any training on it. And so, but there is a large amount, and this is a large amount of metering out there capable for radiation and chemical and radiation. Refrigerants, mercury, more. Again, I said you may run into these with service providers, service techs. So it's important if we're on the scene of a gas leak or a refrigerant leak and you have a service guy there, hey, what capabilities do you have to meter for this? Use them to your advantage. Have them try to help you out. Leak detectors, we'll talk about this a little today as well. A leak detector will detect very low levels of flammable gas. We will get into the numbers a little bit, not that you need to memorize it, but just so you understand the level that this can detect versus our standard LEL meter. A lot of them have some sort of an adjustment knob on them for sensitivity, but it's not going to quantify how much gas you have. So it's not going to keep us safe. When we talk about, are we going into an explosive environment or not? These meters are not for that, or detectors are not for that. These are simply to detect the presence of any level of gas. So when we say, why do we have both? Why do we have a detector and a meter? The detector, again, just detects the presence of gas at a very low level. It's very good for locating leaks. I have a video later that I'll show you that demonstrates that, a lower detection level, but it's not going to evaluate our overall hazard. When we talk about a meter, it's a quantitative display. So I can say, okay, I have 15% of the LEL or whatever the number is. It's good for active monitoring of the hazard. We use it to establish safety lines, but it's not going to pinpoint the location of the leak very well. The meter will go to much higher levels as well than the detector will. So it's important that if you have these, you use them in conjunction with each other, and you don't just take the leak detector in or just take the meter in, but use them together. Again, the meter is going to keep us safe. The detector is kind of going to be that offensive tool to be able to identify where the leak is. So when we talk about why do we have meters, why do we have detectors, why do we need all this stuff, we need to understand how we die. How are these gases going to potentially kill us or the civilians on scene? So we have toxic, flammable, and asphyxiants. And gases can have multiple hazards. So when we talk about toxic gases, we not kind of hear that term. What does it actually mean? It's dangerous for living things. It's dangerous for us to inhale. The good news is with a toxic gas is our SCBA will provide proper respiratory protection from almost every toxic gas out there. So carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen sulfide, obviously ones that we, hear on a daily basis. Our SCBA is going to protect us 100% from these. So on that end, that's the good thing of toxic gases from the firefighter standpoint, is we have the best protection available to keep us safe from them. When we talk about toxic gases, IDLH has to come into play, because what measures how toxic a gas is but IDLH, the level of the immediate dangerous to life or health. Now, this is developed by NIOSH, as with most things in the fire service. It's not fire service driven, it's industry driven. And so the IDLH is not one breath and you're dead. The IDLH is to ensure a worker can evacuate in the event of a failure of respiratory protection. Now, obviously, if we're well above the IDLH, then we could potentially be in the one breath you're dead category. But if we're just at that IDLH level, then the actual definition is allowing you to escape if your SCBA were to fail. It also establishes a maximum level of above which only an SCBA is permitted. Now, just to bring these two up, and I use a lot of the common gases that we know, just so we can kind of put it in our heads of where we're at. But what is more toxic? If I give you these two numbers, carbon monoxide IDLH is 1,200 parts per million, and ammonia IDLH is 300 parts per million. What is actually more dangerous for us to inhale? And the answer would be ammonia, because the lower the IDLH number is, the less of it is required to potentially kill us. So it's important and I kind of use carbon monoxide as my barometer, right? So we go to carbon monoxide every day, or at least the alarms every day. We're seeing them on the meter every day. So if I look up a gas in my NIOSH or in my Wiser app, and it has an IDLH greater than 1,200, I know that on the toxicity level, it's less dangerous than carbon monoxide. And if it has an IDLH less than 1,200, I know that it's more dangerous than carbon monoxide. And that's just kind of a quick, easy barometer for me to tell, kind of what I'm looking at. And again, where can these numbers be found? I mentioned it, the NIOSH guide. And again, our apps on the phone, there's plenty of really good apps that we can download for free and look all of this stuff up. And I do recommend it. All right, so flammable gases is the other way we can die, right? So again, driven from industry, DOT, Department of Transportation, what is the actual definition of a flammable gas? It's got two options: a gas that ignites at room temperature in less than 13% mixture, meaning the LEL, the lower explosive limit in air, is less than 13%, or a gas that ignites at room temperature at any percent of the if the LEL and UEL range is greater than 12%. So either we have a gas that can ignite at room air in less than 13% mixture, meaning we don't need as much of it to ignite, or we have a gas that has such a wide range that the range between the LEL and UEL is greater than 12%. So these would be like acetylene, methane, propane, butane, pentane. That's cool, all these, all right? And we've probably heard these all before. My kind of pet peeve here to bring up is if you look up ammonia, or if you look up, if it's placarded, it's going to say it's a non-flammable gas. But then if you look it up in the NIOSH or in the Wiser, you're going to see that it actually has an LEL of 15% and a UEL of 27%. So why is it considered a non-flammable gas if it does have a flammable range? And if you look, it pretty much just skates by these two requirements here. And there's a reason. Basically, ammonia is used, tremendous amounts of it is used in the farming industry, and the farming lobby is very powerful. So the farming lobby essentially lobbied to keep ammonia out of the definition of a flammable gas, so that they weren't required to add in a lot more restrictions and safety precautions, if you will. So why do I bring this up? Yeah, I think it's a cool story, but why do I bring this up? Just because something is labeled non-flammable does not mean that it does not have a flammable range. So it is still important, even if we go to that tractor trailer and see a placard that says non-flammable gas, don't just automatically say, okay, there's no chance that this gas can blow up. Here we would have ammonia, non-flammable gas. It does have a flammable range. So still look it up in the NIOSH, look it up in the WISER, and find out, does this gas actually have a flammable range? Is this something that we potentially need to be aware of? Asphyxiants is the third way that we're going to die. There's two types of asphyxiants. There's simple asphyxiants, things like nitrogen, helium, propane. I could breathe those in all day outside. The only reason that they become dangerous is because in an enclosed area, they displace the oxygen, and that, by displacing the oxygen, can harm me and limit my ability to breathe, obviously. Now, obviously, propane, we have two definitions there. We have simple asphyxiant, but it's also a flammable gas. That's, again, where we're talking about there's a couple different definitions. Chemical asphyxiants, same thing. You're going to see that, COOH, CnH2S, those are a couple of those chemical asphyxiants where it's not just crowding out the oxygen, but it's affecting the oxygen transportation in the body on an actual chemical level. So it's more than just crowding out the oxygen. Again, what's the good thing about these two things? We have our SCBA, and that can protect us 100% from these on the asphyxiant level. So that's important to remember. So units of measurement, probably one of the more important things. And, again, when you're talking, and again, this is not what your meter looks like. I use this as an example of all of the different types of units of measurement when we're talking about gases. So we've got parts per million, which is literally that, 1 part per 1 million parts. And that's usually when we're talking about IDLH, that's going to be represented in parts per million. So our toxic gases are usually going to be represented in parts per million on the meter. Percent in air. So we have we could have 0% oxygen in air. We could have 100% oxygen in air. We know that oxygen is 20.9, 20.8%, 1/5 of the atmosphere. So when we're talking about O2, it's reading that gas in air. There are meters that are able to read the entire gas in air, meaning it could read methane from 0 to 100%. That's not what your meter does. And that leads into percent of LEL. That's what your meter is doing. And I have a couple slides that'll explain this a little bit better. But your meter, that Ldl sensor, the explosive level combustible gas sensor, is reading percent of LEL. So 0% LEL to 100% LEL. It is not reading 0% in air to 100% in air. The number could potentially be converted to air, but we're not doing that. We just care about, are we at that lower explosive level or not? So percent versus ppm. Again, there's a lot that we want to break down here to make sure that you're giving correct readings and you're understanding the readings that you're reading. So 1 part per million, as I said, 1 out of a million parts, the higher the number, the more concentration there is, but the lower the number, the more deadly it is. The lower the IDLH number, the more deadly it is, as I said before. Percent in air, usually the only sensor that we're carrying that reads a percent in air is the oxygen. And remember, it's only reading 1/5 of the atmosphere. So I have a slide that'll explain that a little bit better later, but as that oxygen level changes, that's only reading 1/5 of the atmosphere. We have to remember that the other 4/5 is changing as well. And then percent of LEL, this is the percentage of the lower explosive limit of what the meter is calibrated to. So we have to understand our meters are calibrated to methane, and this percent of LEL, while it can be used to read any combustible gas out there or any flammable gas out there, is only accurate on a 1-to-1 ratio to the gas that it's calibrated to, which is natural gas or methane. And I'll explain that in a couple slides as well. So when we talk about percent in air, we could have 0% in air, we could have 100% in air. We know that our oxygen level should be 20.9, 20.8, depending, okay? So that's where our oxygen level is, 1/5 of the atmosphere. Our O2 sensor should be reading 20.9% in air. When we talk about the flammability range, this is not how our meter is reading, but we have 0%. We could have 0% of natural gas in air, or we could have 100% of natural gas in air, right? So we could have 0 or 100%. If we're at 5%, that's our lower explosive limit. So in this area, we would be too lean. We don't have enough of the gas to burn. 15% is our upper explosive limit. So in this center area of air, if we have between 5 and 15% of methane in the air, we are in that explosive range. Less than that, too lean. More than that, too rich. All right. Are there any questions on that? This is one of those where like it cascades. So if you don't understand the first slide, it only gets worse from there. Now, where is our meter actually reading? So the orange box is where that LEL sensor is actually reading. Okay. So it's not reading inside the flammable range, and it's not reading above the flammable range. Our LEL sensor for methane is only reading in the 0 to 100, I call it 99%, in the 0 to 99% range. Our meter does not read in this area above here. We only read in the LEL range. So if we go above 100%, I have no idea if I'm in this LEL range, if I'm actually in the explosive range, or if I'm above the explosive range. Our meter does not tell us that. That's important to remember. All right, and this just the last two slides kind of together so you can kind of see. We have our explosive range. This is where our meter is reading, and this is the top side is our entire air. And we'll get into that when we get into the sensors a little bit. But when we're reporting meter readings, this is some of the issues that I've heard. If we're on air, we have to remember that it can sometimes be hard to hear what we're saying. So the handy-talkie goes right against the voice emitter. We have to say each digit as well as the number. So we're not just going to have 35 parts per million of CO. I have 35 parts per million of CO or carbon monoxide. Say it out. Know what units the meter is reading in. If you don't, then just say, if you're having a brain fart and it says ppm and you can't remember what that is, then just say ppm. But if you say percent or percent LEL or percent in air and you're wrong, as the incident commander, I would be like, wow, I need to get someone in there that knows what's going on. Okay. Know what the gas is called. Otherwise, just say the letter. Same thing. A lot of guys will mix up hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen sulfide, and I get that. So if you can't remember, just say, I have 35 parts per million of HCN. If you say hydrogen sulfide and you meant hydrogen cyanide, they may not catch that on the outside. So that would certainly lead to some confusion. And the incident commander or whoever you're giving the reports to, they should repeat it back to you. They're not going to be on air. So you got to make sure that they understood what you said. And again, these are for critical readings. If we're on air, it's probably critical readings. We should have it repeated back to us so that everyone's on the same page. So why does all this matter? I'm not going to read this, but this basically talks about the Mars probe from the late 90s when you had half of the scientists working in the metric system, half the scientists working in inches and feet or whatever, miles, and they basically ended up, feet and pounds, and they ended up losing the spacecraft because no one was talking to each other. They didn't make sure that they were all on the same page. So same thing with us here. Now, to take this to really where it affects us on the fire ground is generally dealing with the utility personnel. When the utility personnel, I'll go back to this, when the utility personnel are coming up on scene, most of the time, if it's a gas company, they only deal with that gas. So the propane company only deals with propane. The natural gas company only deals with natural gas. Not all of the time, but a lot of the time, they will read in percent in air because they want to know, am I above the LEL? Am I in the explosive range or am I below it? So there are times where I'll go up to the guy and before I knew this, say, hey, what do you got? And he'll say, I have 5%. Now, if I have 5% on my LEL meter, I'm like, okay, there's a good amount of gas there, but I'm not like freaking out or anything like that. But what he was talking about was 5% in air. So he was actually at the lower explosive limit. So when you're specifically talking with utility company personnel, make sure that you're specifying, are you reading percent in air or are you reading percent LEL? That would be very important. So then the specific sensors that we're talking about. So we have basically 4 main sensors. We're going to touch on 4, but 3 is what you guys use. So we have electrochemical sensors. This uses 2 to 3 electrodes, basically gases. Toxic gases are reactive. And so as more gas enters the electrode, it changes the voltage, and that's what gives us a measurement, okay? So the advantage of these electrochemical sensors, and this is what would be used on like CO, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen cyanide. The good thing with these is, and O2 it gets used for as well, it's a quick response and it's gas specific. So for the most part, though, there are cross sensitivities that we'll talk about. You're only reading the gas that you want to read. Whereas when we talk about LEL, you could be reading a variety of different gases. Any flammable gas will register on the LEL sensor. The catalytic bead sensor, this is that LEL sensor. It's used to measure flammable gases. It uses what's called the Wheatstone bridge theory. I'll let you read that. Now, this is calibrated to a specific gas, but it will measure all flammable gases. So again, that's very important to remember that as we're walking through and getting a reading on our LEL sensor, while it's only going to be accurate for the gas that it's calibrated to, which is methane, it will read any gas out there. So we have to realize that the readings that we're getting on that meter, if it's not methane, are not going to be one for one accurate. The one thing to remember about our LEL sensor is that it is dependent on temperature and O2. As our temperature changes, as our oxygen levels change, we know that gas flammability can change as well. Again, this isn't something that we're going to be calculating or figuring out on scene, but just realize that if your O2 levels are changing, then potentially the readings that you're getting on your LEL sensor may not be 100% correct. The PID sensor, this is that new sensor that you guys have gotten. It's for volatile organic compounds. Basically, gas is brought into the chamber. It's ionized by a UV lamp, and depending on how the level of that lamp changes, that's what's going to give us how much parts per million of something we have. I'll give you some better examples of this later, but basically you buy a specific bulb and it will only read gases with an electron volt or ionization potential less than that number. So you guys have a 10.6 bulb. So when you guys are looking up gases in the NIOSH guide, if it has less than 10.6, then that's going to be a gas that you guys can read on the PID meter. The infrared sensors, this is not a sensor that you guys have in your arsenal, but it's just good to know that it's out there. It absorbs gas based on the radiation, and more gas, more absorbed infrared energy, the weakened light, and that's what gives you your reading. There are two times that this sensor gets used a lot is for LEL and CO2, carbon dioxide. The reason why, and what's nice about it is it's not affected by oxygen or temperature. The reason why it's not used widely for LEL, number one, cost, it's a very expensive sensor. And number two, it does not see some of the more common gases like acetylene. So it wouldn't be a good do-it-all sensor because it doesn't detect all of the gases that we come across. So we are going to go through the 4-gas meter. That is your meat and potatoes meter of what you guys are carrying on a day in, day out basis. And then at the end, I'll turn it on and just make sure you guys are all on the same page with operation and whatnot. So the LEL sensor, this is that catalytic bead sensor. This is our percent in the LEL. It has, again, it will give us a measurement for any flammable gas, but it's only going to be accurate to what it's calibrated to, which is methane. It displays in 0 to 100%, only accurate for what it's calibrated to, which for Draeger is methane. Most common alarms would be a low alarm of 10%, a high alarm of 20%. Now, correction factors. So you can take this as deep as you want to. I will show you how to use it. But again, it's not something that we're going to be doing on a daily basis for a couple of reasons. So correction factors are used as a guide. The rule of thumb is you take the number that you have on the LEL. If it's not methane, but it's a common gas that you've heard of, you double it, you multiply it by 2. And if it's a gas that you haven't heard of, multiply it by 3. And I'll explain that on the next slide. This sensor has a longer warm up. So when we talk about when to fire the meter up, this sensor takes a little bit longer to warm up. So it'll take a little bit longer to give you accurate readings, and it'll take a little bit longer to allow you to fresh air calibrate the meter. And as I said, it's affected by O2 levels. So this is a correction factor sheet for a LEL sensor. And again, all this is doing is taking our known gases. So say we're going to an acetone leak, okay? So we have acetone here. This just tells us what the LEL is, so 2.5%. And remember, natural gas is 5%. So this would be more flammable than natural gas. And the correction factor is a number here. So if we were to do the correction factor for this, pull up the calculator. And you're not going to pull up a calculator on scene, and that's why I show you those 2 and 3 type things. So pull up the calculator here. Let's say I had 10%. Let's say my meter was reading 10% LEL. I just take the 10 and multiply it by 1.83. So multiply it by 1.83, and my meter is actually showing 18.3% LEL. So you can see acetone, something we've heard of. Acetylene, something we've heard of. Ammonia, something we've heard of. And then, so as you go through this, you can see kind of the common gases that we hear of. Propane, something we've heard of. And if you look at those correction factors, they're all less than 2. That's why I say if it's a gas that we're kind of very, aware of, just multiply it by 2. That's your kind of, safe factor there. And then as you get to some more exotic gases, ethylic, the things you can't even pronounce, and it's got a correction factor of 2.67, now you're multiplying it by 3, and it should keep you within that safe realm. I know gasoline's a little different, it's higher, but we all know gasoline is flammable pretty much all the time, so just keep that in mind. What I will say with this is, again, it's not something that you're necessarily going to be doing on scene. Just do it in your head, multiply by 2 or 3. That'll get you within the ballpark if you don't know what you're metering. But the most important thing to remember is that this meter is only metering where you're holding it. So there are, natural gas is lighter than air, propane is heavier than air. There's a very good chance that if you have 20% of the LEL on the first floor of a propane leak, then in the basement or in some void somewhere, you are at that explosive level. So that's why I don't get too into the correction factors, but it is good to know that they're out there. Okay. Any questions on that? All right, so that's our LEL sensor. Our carbon monoxide is an electrochemical sensor. Yours and most CO meters will do up to 2,000 parts per million, some less, some more. Remember, the 1,200 parts per million is our ideal H, so we are going above the 1,200 parts per million. I am not going to read this bottom table. You guys all know what the CO signs and symptoms are. Cross sensitivities. This is something that does plague fire departments from time to time. The CO meter, while it is very accurate, it does have cross sensitivities, meaning that it will read other gases that are not carbon monoxide. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, so you can't say, oh, well, I don't have a hydrogen meter, so I'm going to take this carbon monoxide meter in and go meter for hydrogen. That's not going to be accurate on a 1-to-1 ratio. But you have to be aware that if you do go for a CO alarm sounding and you go in there and you're getting readings on your carbon monoxide meter, there is potentially another gas that's affecting it. If you can't figure out, hey, there's nothing burning here, there's no boiler where we shut it down and we're still getting readings on our CO meter, what's going on here? So some of the most common, cross sensitivities in the industry, acetylene. If you have an acetylene leak that's very light, it will a lot of the time register on the CO meter before it registers on the LEL sensor. Hydrogen is a very common one, especially with all these batteries charging now. You may have low levels of hydrogen that are setting off the CO meter if the battery is not charging properly. So just be aware that cross sensitivities do exist, and if you really cannot figure out what's setting off your CO alarm, then consider something in the cross sensitivity realm of things. H2S, the sewer gas, hydrogen sulfide. Again, electrochemical sensor, generally found in confined space. Toxicity is the main hazard, but it is a flammable and corrosive gas as well. Oxygen, probably one of the most underutilized sensors on our meter, just because we're always used to it being 20.9%. But we have to understand what's happening. It should read 20.9. However, it's only a measurement of 1/5 of our atmosphere. Oxygen enrichment is dangerous for flammability. Oxygen deficiency is obviously dangerous for life sustainability. The most important question to ask yourself is, what is displacing the oxygen? Now, if we're outside and I'm getting fluctuations on my oxygen sensor, I'm probably leaning towards there's an issue with my oxygen sensor. What are the, how do we displace enough oxygen outside? We're going to have 20.9%. But when I go into an enclosed structure, particularly when I go, underground where there's limited or no ventilation, if I'm starting to get movement on my oxygen sensor, I really need to think about what's displacing it and potentially be masking up or evacuating. So math, and again, not math that you need to do, but math that you should be aware of. When we talk about 1% volume in air, so if I go 1%, if I have a meter that's reading in air and I move 1% on that, that's 10,000 parts per million. So if O2 oxygen is only 1/5 of the atmosphere, remember when I said when we change oxygen, we're only reading 1/5 of the atmosphere. Then when I go, if my meter goes from 20.9% to 19.9%, and you may say that's not a big deal, I'm not even an alarm yet, that's 50,000 parts per million of something that's displacing it. If I told you that basement has 50,000 parts per million of carbon monoxide, you're going to be masked up, and you know that anyone down there is probably dead if they've been down there for any period of time. And yet here we are with our oxygen sensor. It hasn't even alarmed yet at 19.9%, and we could potentially have 50,000 parts per million of something in the basement. So all I'm trying to get across to you is just because your meter's not alarming, make sure you're keeping an eye on this oxygen sensor. And if you're going, down into a basement or into an enclosed area and it starts to move, you need to consider that you're going into a highly hazardous atmosphere. So on that note, we're going to talk about alarms. Each sensor has a low alarm and a high alarm. Alarms are all audible, visual, and vibratory, but they'll usually be different at the low alarm and high alarm level. They are customizable if we needed to. The O2 oxygen has a low alarm and a high alarm. So depending on which way you go, we want to be aware of both movements. The low alarm is usually non-latching, and what that means is the meter is going to silence without acknowledgement. So if my CO low alarm is 35 parts per million, I go up to 40 parts per million, it alarms, and then I walk outside, I come back and it goes down to 0, it's going to stop alarming. I never acknowledged it, so there's no guarantee that I even knew that it went off. The alarms can be silenced. So if it stays in low alarm, it remains at 40 parts per million, which is above my low alarm, but below my high alarm. I can silence the meter and continue operating. The standard is 35 parts per million of CO, 10% LEL, anywhere outside of 19.5 or 23.5% of oxygen, 10 parts per million of hydrogen sulfide, 2.5 parts per million of HCN, hydrogen cyanide. Again, these numbers can be adjusted. So if you're in another department or something and it doesn't jive with this, that's not abnormal. The high alarm is usually latching. This means that that my meter will not silence until I acknowledge the alarm. So if my high alarm for CO is 100 parts per million, I go to an environment that's 150 parts per million, and I have a video of this, so I'll show it. I go to an environment that's 150 parts per million, the meter alarms, I come back outside, my meter dropped down to 0, but it's still alarming because at one point it went into the high alarm, so it will not silence until until I acknowledge it. The alarm usually, while it's going off, cannot be silenced. So if I go into that environment and I'm operating in an environment that has the high alarm, I cannot silence the meter. And it's a different tone, vibration, and lighting than the low alarm, just to differentiate. These are the standard high alarm levels: 50 parts per million CO, 20 parts per million LEL, 15 of hydrogen sulfide, and 4.5 of hydrogen cyanide. All right, so just make this is going to be an example of the alarms. So this is that low alarm. I went into the low alarm, came back down, and it automatically silenced. So potentially, if you were talking to me, I may not have known that it went into alarm. Now I'm going to put more gas on it, and I'm going to let it go into the high alarm. You're going to see that LEL comes up about 20%. So it goes into the high alarm, and then I'm going to let it drop back down. You're going to see that it drops into the low alarm, and then I don't remember how low it goes, but yeah, now I'm below the low alarm, but I'm still a high alarm choice because I have not acknowledged it yet. It wants to know, hey, alarm one, using that high alarm. So now I silence it. Okay. So that's the difference between a latching and a non-latching alarm. Latching, you need to acknowledge it even if you drop down. Non-latching, you do not need to. Locking alarm. This is something that I have had departments run into with their Draeger meters. And basically what happens is you subject it to too much gas. And usually this happens in two scenarios. So what happens is the sensor says, oh my God, we went way too high here. I can't take any more gas in. So it basically locks out the sensor. What this does is saves the sensor's life so that it doesn't get completely saturated, destroyed, and needs to be replaced. So the solution for this, and what will usually happen is you'll get either 3 pluses or 3 like right angles coming up on the meter. Actually, you'll see it in the next slide showing that you went over range. And what you need to do is turn the meter off and then turn it back on in a clean environment, and that will let the meter cycle through. What's important, the two scenarios I've seen this happen. Number one, the idiots that put it right up to the exhaust of the truck to test it. That will saturate the meter in 2 seconds. So please don't do that. And it could potentially melt with the temperature of exhaust these days. It could melt the meter. And then second is what I'll see a lot of times is when we have a faulty boiler, we'll be metering in and around it. And maybe someone will put the meter down to check something with the boiler, and they'll put it like right where the exhaust is. And so the exhaust goes right into the meter and actually saturates it. So just be aware of those things. And it may need a fresh air cal or a span calibration after it is restarted. So this is a meter that's going over range. And what you're gonna see the difference here too is our oxygen level is gonna change. I'm doing the same experiment that I just did. This compressed gas duster actually works really well for showing meters. You're setting off meters. I'll show you guys that in a little bit. But this will show you a locking alarm. You can see that too, like right angle thing. That shows that we went over range. And so there's no level of acknowledgement. There's no level of letting it sit in fresh air that will reset the meter. I have to turn it off and back on. Side note, don't do that experiment because again, you're putting this stuff right on the sensors. You can spray it in the area of, but we'll talk about that a little bit later as well, because that was something we were seeing a lot with COVID. So peak readings, ability to see the peak readings on the meter so we can see how low the oxygen was, how high the oxygen was, and how high the other 3 sensors were as well. We can reset this manually or the meter will reset. It will reset your peaks when you turn the meter off and back on. All right. So I had that if you have a non-Draeger meter, but for us, we don't have to worry about that. So this is useful if we're not paying attention to the meter 100%. Say I went in with the meter, found a couple people unconscious, dragged them out, and then I want to see how high did it get when I was in there. This is also a good option if you had a confined space and you didn't have a pump and hose available. You could, put this onto your utility rope, drop it down the hole, and then, pull it back up, scroll through your peaks, and be able to tell, what you were at down there. So the final gas and the new gas that we have, and this is only going to be in that safety officer's vehicle, is the volatile organic compounds. So there's, I'm going to define it, and then I'm going to kind of just in layman's terms give it to you as well. Variety of chemicals, generally human-made, that can be toxic. A PID meter is a lot like an LEL meter. It's not going to identify the specific chemical that you're metering, okay? So if you have a variety of different chemicals, this isn't going to tell you, oh, we're reading this one and not that one. Now, you can sometimes use it to narrow down which one you're reading, but by itself, it's not going to identify those chemicals. It's just going to tell you there's something there, as long as it has that ionization potential less than 10.6. So why do we have this meter? Our initial focus with this meter should be to identify a toxic situation or a potentially toxic situation, don our SCBA, perform a primary search of the area. Then we can pull back and treat it like any other hazmat, the wait and see, the let's, hazmat huddle, kind of figure out what we have going on. But initially, this meter is great for figuring out that we have a potentially toxic atmosphere. We need to mask up, we need to get in and do a primary search. Again, similar concept to the Ldl sensor. It's not going to identify a specific gas, just the presence of a gas in that family. So when we talk about some of the common gases that a PID meter is going to identify, you can read them up here. And some of them are obviously going to be identified as well in other sensors that we have. Like I showed you before, acetone has a LEL, UEL, so that if we have enough of it, could potentially be identified in the LEL sensor as well. And then there are a variety of gases that wouldn't be. So usually we're going to have a 10.6 EV bulb ionization potential, and that's what you guys have. So it will read any gas with an ionization potential less than 10.6. So when you're reading into the, if you're presented with, say, an MSDS sheet from the manufacturing facility, it may say on the MSDS sheet what the ionization potential is. If not, you could look it up in your Wiser app or your NIOSH book, and this would be able to narrow down which gas you're potentially reading. Yours does, and many PID meters do have common gases stored for correction factors. So if you wanted to, if you said, okay, I know that this is the gas that I'm reading on my meter, you could go into your meter and adjust the correction factor there. Again, probably not something you're going to do. We're focused on life safety, identification of a potential toxic gas, primary search, ventilation, and then we can go back in there and remeter. So I like to bring up these as our common gases or common flammable gases that we run into on a daily basis, natural gas and propane. Are these going to be identified on the PID? Because I've gotten calls saying, hey, I went to we were at a natural gas and a propane leak or a propane leak, and we were getting readings on our PID meter, but I looked up natural gas and propane, and both of their ionization potentials are greater than 10.6. So why was I getting readings on our PID meter? And we have to remember that natural gas and propane do not have an odor. An odor is added to them. The odor is usually ethyl mercaptan that's added to them. And if you look down there, the ionization potential of ethyl mercaptan is 9.29. So what we're actually reading, if you go into a natural gas leak and you're getting readings on and you're carrying the new meter that I'll go through with you that the safety officer has, you're getting readings on the LEL, but you're also getting readings on the PID. Realize that that's why you may be getting readings on the PID, because of the odorant, the ethyl mercaptan that's put into that gas. And you will probably actually get that reading before you get the LEL. So while it's not a true leak detector, you are getting readings of that natural gas or propane at a lower level, because you're reading the ethyl mercaptan in a parts per million range versus a percent LEL range. And remember what we said, 1% is 10,000 parts per million, or 10,000 parts per million, depending on how the meter's calibrated. So it's a tremendous amount of gas in order to get that LEL sensor to move. So this is, again, when I was using this stuff before, the compressed gas dust off stuff, it has this difluorothane in there. If you read the label, it's got difluorothane in there. So is that going to read on our PID meter? And the answer is no, because it's got a PID of 11.865, which is greater than 10.6. And so I just use these kind of examples as which one's going to read on our PID meter. If you walked into my garage and you saw maybe a bunch of these canisters, and then you saw a couple propane cylinders, and you were getting readings on, say, the LEL, but not the PID, then you could probably narrow it down to the dust off, because that's not going to show up on your PID. If you walk in and you're getting readings on the PID and on your LEL, then it's probably the propane, because you have the propane that's flammable giving you your LEL readings, and your ethyl mercaptan that's giving you the PID. So it's a very crude beginning example of how we can use the PID to narrow down materials. Suffice to say, for you guys in an industrial setting, the MSDS sheets is where you're going to get a lot of information of what gases are in there, if you were looking to start kind of narrowing down which gas you actually have present. So I touched on this before, but why can leak detectors be helpful? Many leak detectors will alert you that you have the combustible gas in the 20 to 50 parts per million range. And so I kind of go back on this. I could have put this slide earlier, but we really didn't talk much about LEL yet. So I wanted to do that before I kind of threw this at you. So for an LEL meter calibrated to methane to show 1% of gas would equal about 500 parts per million. Remember, methane has an LEL of 5% in air. 5% in air is 50,000. So 1% of 50,000 is 500 parts per million. I don't ever need you to do that math again. Suffice to say, all I'm trying to explain to you is that when our leak detector can detect 20 to 50 parts per million of gas, for our LEL sensor to show 1% of gas would be 10 times that. So we're going to get a much lower detection rate with those leak detectors, or potentially our PID meter, than we will by using that LEL meter. Okay. So this is just a stove top example. I have my LEL meter on the left, my leak detector on the right, and you're going to see how the leak detector goes off. And actually at no point through this does my LEL sensor. All right, so the leak detectors can be very useful for just that, leak detecting. So some general metering guidelines. Always confirm meter readings with a second meter. Don't call in the cavalry from one meter reading. Things break, things can read differently. So it's always good to have a second meter, a second meter to confirm the first readings. We want to meter low, middle, and high. We got to remember that different gases have different molecular weights. Have an idea of the basic ones. So CO, you should know, is fairly neutral, maybe rises a little bit. Propane sinks, methane, natural gas rises. So just have a decent idea of some of those basic ones that you go to. So we have a natural gas leak on the first floor, am I more concerned about going above or below versus propane? The meter, as it sits, is only going to read in its immediate location. Okay, so here I am on one side of my room. I'm not reading the other side of the room. So it's important that we move around and we move the meter up and down so that we're able to read in different areas of the room. Readings could be drastically different in one area than another, different rooms, or different pockets pocket areas where gas can collect. The readings do take time to register. So the lower the readings, the more time it's going to take to register. And it's going to take even more time if we're using a hose or a pump. It's important to obviously investigate or not interrogate, but ask the occupant questions. If they ventilated the building prior to we got there, if they ventilated the building before we got there, obviously that's going to affect our readings, but they may not have ventilated pockets, places where pockets of gas could collect. So that may be a decent area that we can put the meter in order to get readings. So data logging, I just go through this real quick so that you're aware of it. Every meter on the market will log readings. It also logs its last calibration. It's basically the black box of the meter. It will overwrite the data as it runs out of memory, so there's nothing that you have to do. What's important is it can be downloaded to a computer and printed out. So if you guys go to a high profile incident, and I kind of consider high profile like death or close to death or something that you think might be litigated down the line, then this could be downloaded to your computer and saved as a copy, a record for the lawyers, PD, whatever the case may be. Usually about 1,000 events, and most meters will take a record every 30 seconds to a minute. So just be aware it's there. You go to a high profile event, we can download those readings and save them for future litigation, because that's the world we live in now. Pumps. So we can add pumps onto the meters in order to draw air in from remote areas. It actually sucks the air in. So depending on how far our hose is or how far our probe is, we can suck air in and get readings from remote areas. The pump can be integrated or detachable. For the XAM 2500 you guys have, I forget how many pumps you have, but they're obviously detachable. For the new XAM 8000 that you have, the pump is actually built in. Hoses or probes can be hooked into the pump. The rule of thumb is about a second a foot. So if you have a 20-foot hose on there, It's going to take about 20 seconds for the air to get sucked through the meter. There's a variety of different probes and hoses out there. I'm not going to go through every single one. This is just a filter to keep the moisture from getting drawn in. It's very important that if you're dropping it into a hole or something, we don't want to submerge it in liquid and have that suck through, because that will obviously probably destroy what we're trying to do. This just says different hoses. You guys have a long hose, I think it's 50 feet. You can cut them to whatever length you need to based on your hazards. I wouldn't want to keep one 50-foot hose for the 150-foot sewer I have if most of mine are 10 to 15, 20 feet. I'd want I'd want to use the 10, 15, 20-foot one most of the time, and then keep that 50-foot one for a bad day. All right, so this is just a quick example of how long it takes. So I'm going to spray that dust off here, and you're going to see how long it takes to travel to the meter. So I'll see departments come in with their meters like that for a regular, residential meter investigation. I don't like having the pump on there with, all my hose, because you can see how long it takes. You could potentially walk into a very toxic environment and not know about it for 20 seconds or so. So I don't know how many seconds that was, but you understand what I'm saying. So again, it's up to you, but I like to, if I don't need a pump, I'm just bringing the meter in regular. So don't stick meters into exhaust. I mentioned that. If you guys are still doing aerosol cleanings, just be very careful. Really don't want to spray it directly on the sensors. They have a lot of chemicals in there that could potentially be cross-sensitive or poison the meters. So pull the meters out of the compartment if you're going to spray it down. Don't spray the meter down, or don't spray the compartment down, then put the meter in there and close the compartment. Make sure you let it air out. I don't know how much of this is happening anymore, but it's definitely something that has affected meters in the last few years. Try not to get moisture on the sensors. So whether that means spraying them with a hose line or something like that, moisture is not good for them. So try to avoid that. Fresh air calibration. This is probably, this is probably the most important thing that you can do on a general maintenance level to make sure that your meters are working properly. I haven't found a better example, so I just say that this is kind of the equivalent of having your pass alarm go off and taking the pack out of service without trying to reset it first. Okay, fresh air calibration is the first thing you should do if you have any issues with your meter. What it does is it allows sensors to develop a baseline reference to 0 as long as there's a limited window of correction. So what does that mean? If I have 2 parts per million, negative 2 parts per million, and I'm standing outside in the fresh air, my fresh air calibration should bring all of that back to 0. What it doesn't mean is if I'm reading 300 parts per million and I'm in a fresh air environment and I try to fresh air calibrate it, the meter's going to say, whoa, there's something else going on. You need to calibrate this meter. This is the single largest region of negative numbers. As we get further away from when we calibrated the meter last, we're going to start to get some drift on the sensors. Fresh air calibration should bring us back to 0. We only want a fresh air cal in a clean environment. Again, preference to being outdoors away from the exhaust of the apparatus. It won't 0 if we're high negative or positive readings. The fresh air cal is, if fresh air cal is performed in dirty environments, then this can and will affect our future readings. So if I'm in 10 parts per million of CO and I perform a fresh air cal on the meter, it probably will take it, but now I'm going to be off by about 10 parts per million there on out until I fresh air cal it again in a true clean environment. Now with the Draeger meters, they do not fresh air cal on startup. I forget if this is in the PowerPoint, so I'm just going to say it now. They do not fresh air calibrate on startup. But when you start the meters up, they do require a 3 to 5 minute warm-up period before it will let you fresh air calibrate the meter. So my recommendation, and I know, and this is going to be different based on the manufacturer. So if another manufacturer told you different, it's not that they're wrong and I'm right. It's that every meter is different. I would start the meter up as soon as you get the call. Let the meter warm up in the apparatus while you're driving to the incident. When you get to the incident, you can get onto the front lawn. If your meter's not reading all zeros, then you can fresh air calibrate it and be ready to go when you get in. If you wait until you get on scene to fresh air calibrate the meter, then, or I'm sorry, if you wait on scene to turn on the meter, it's going to need that 3 to 5 minutes to warm up on the front lawn, and you're just going to be standing there. So that would be my recommendation. Turn the meter on as soon as you get the call, let it warm up on the way driving there, and then you can fresh air cal on the front lawn. But it's not required to use the meter. If you start the meter up, everything looks good, then by all means go in, start metering. I'm not going to get into these too much because this isn't what you guys are doing on the line, but a bump test is just testing the meter, making sure that it goes into alarm. Span calibration is what we're actually, when you say calibrate the meter, that's what you're doing. Span calibration, you're actually making the meter read a specific gas to a specific quantity, saying, okay, this is what you should read. Think of calibration as like making sure your speedometer is reading correctly. All right, drift. I mentioned this a little bit, positive or negative readings around 0. This could be because of cross sensitivities. It could be because of change in humidity. If you fresh air cal'd the meter on a day that had 10% humidity, and now today's a 90% day of humidity, that could definitely cause that little bit of drift. It could be low levels of gas. It could be the need for a fresh air cal. It could be the need for a cal. If we haven't calibrated the meter in a while, we will start to get some drift. But again, if we get drift, we're not taking the meter out of service and calling me. This is the first thing that we're doing, fresh air calibrating. If it continues to drift after that, now maybe we're going to take it out of service. But the first thing is fresh air cal. All right, I'll run through some case studies really quickly, and then I'll pull out the meters and we'll go through those, okay? So case studies, this was one I was on, 4-story building, tire repair shop on the first floor, apartments above, so your typical mixed occupancy. At 8 p.m. in the evening, we got a CO alarm on the second floor. Went up there. The occupant had already vented prior to our arrival, so we were getting 0 on the CO. But we closed the windows, seeing if it went up. It did not. We checked the cellar where the oil burner was. No readings there. So we took up and went home. 2 a.m. Same thing. They called us. You know, we said if it goes off again, call us again. Don't open the windows. We get there. And we were finding some CO readings on their second floor apartment. What we were not finding, still no readings in the oil burner room, and we were not able to find a source in their apartment that was creating CO. What did it end up being? Well, we forced entry into that tire repair shop on the first floor, and an acetylene tank was leaking. It wasn't enough to set off our Ldl sensor, but we were getting low levels on that carbon monoxide meter. Acetylene is much lighter than air, so it was coming up through the floor into their second floor apartment. So not accurate readings on our CO meter, but the cross sensitivity gave us the idea that there was something else going on. This was local in Monroe, 1-story ranch, CO alarm at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. The occupant had just gotten home. It was fall time. Her CO alarm was ringing, so she called 911. As soon as I went in there, I went in with a floor gas meter. As soon as I went in there, everything pinged. LEL went up, O2 went down, CO went up. I don't remember what hydrogen sulfide did, but there was no odor. Now, I was 1 foot in the front door, so no odor. I backed out, SCBA, primary search, vent, all that stuff. Couldn't figure out what it was. Shut down the oil burner, shut down the propane tank. I could not figure out what it was, but every time we closed the building up, it started going up again. Turns out what was happening was there was a crew working on the street, and what they had an issue with their water line. The water line that went from the street to the house, there was a break in there somewhere. And the way the crew fixes it, or the way they identify where the leak is they pump hydrogen in from the street and then use like a probe along the front lawn, because hydrogen is so much lighter than air, it will come up through the ground, and they can probe through the front lawn and see where the hydrogen is coming up. Unfortunately, her leak was right at the foundation. So when they were pumping hydrogen in, they were pumping it into her basement. That's what was giving us readings in our LEL. Hydrogen is obviously explosive. CO, hydrogen is cross-sensitive with CO. And they actually put so much hydrogen into their cellar that we were getting a decrease on oxygen. So again, just kind of putting everything together there. I'm not going to go through that. Well, this is basically just showing us CO is flammable, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I'm not going to go through that one specifically. If you guys remember in the Bronx a few years ago, this is the Chief Fahey fire where he was killed. And basically this was because everything was done right. The lines were made, evacuated the building and everything. He was standing across the street and it was a freak accident. But what capabilities we did not have at this scene was the ability to read above the LEL levels of 100. So we did not know if we were in that explosive level or if we were above that explosive level. Since then, the hazmat companies, the squad companies have been given meters, actually these meters, but changed differently, where they can actually read percent in air. So we do know if we're in that 5 to 15 range or if we're above that 15 range. I'm not going to play this video, but I am going to talk about carbon dioxide in the next couple slides. But this woman dies. That's a video from a few years ago where in Phoenix, there was a call for an unconscious person in the cellar of a restaurant, and it ended up being a carbon dioxide leak. And that's something that we're going to start seeing a lot more. A lot of departments are starting to purchase carbon dioxide meters so that because these soda machines run on carbon dioxide and they're stored in the cellar, if they have a leak, it's going to be a very quick asphyxiation issue. This is why I made this, another reason why I made this presentation. I had someone say they had 20 parts per million on their oxygen sensor. Again, we got to know the units of measurement that we're in. So common questions. I smell gas, but I have no readings. We touched on this a little bit. If we're not using a leak detector, there's a very good chance that we have a very low level of gas that is not registering on our LEL sensor. On the flip side, I don't smell gas, but I do have readings, whether it be on our LEL sensor or on our leak detector. We have to remember that that odorant is added, the ethyl mercaptan is added to the gas. So if we're at a facility, it's possible, and this would be something that you ask the people working there, it's possible that they're using gas that does not have an odorant added to it. So that would be an important question. If it's an underground leak, then it's a very good possibility that the ground has actually scrubbed the odorant off of the gas, out of the gas. So as the gas comes up and migrates through the ground, the odorant is scrubbed out, and that's why we wouldn't get a reading, or that's why we would not get an odor, but we would get a reading on our meter. And obviously the third scenario is that you have COVID and you should probably go home. So if CO is flammable, CO has a flammability and it's labeled as a flammable gas. If it has a flammability range of about 12.5 to 74%, why are we not seeing LEL readings? And why, when we go to a CO alarm, are we not concerned about the flammability of CO? It's a very good question. We have to remember, and we'll throw some math in here, 12.5% in air is 125,000 parts per million. So our lower explosive level of CO is 125,000 parts per million. Remember, our IDLH is 1,200 parts per million. So CO is going to kill you well before it becomes flammable. Now, the exception to that is when we're talking about like underground confined space areas. If we have a manhole fire, you guys saw Greenwich had one a couple weeks ago, and if you have underground utilities running at all, if those wires start to burn under there, they create a tremendous amount of carbon monoxide, and that could potentially create a pocket of CO that has our 12.5% of LEL or 12.5% mixture in there. And then if that hits a circuit breaker or something like that, or an electrical panel, that could be the spark that ignites it underground. So if we're getting CO migration underground, although maybe in the basement you're only getting 500 parts per million of CO, you have to consider that in a very confined area somewhere else, there could potentially be an explosive level of carbon monoxide. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. And if you've taken our fire behavior class, I think there's a good argument that some of our void explosions during fires, if it's a knee wall or a cockloft, those could possibly be a carbon monoxide explosion or a form of that as well. And remember, 12.5 to 74% is a very wide range. Methane, 5 to 15. So carbon monoxide is a very flammable gas. It just requires a lot of it. We talked about CO2 meters being used a lot in fast food restaurants and whatnot. So this is something that your CO2 systems being used a lot more. The other place, a buddy of mine does a lot of HVAC refrigeration on the commercial level, and they're starting to transition a lot to carbon dioxide from ammonia. So this is something that we're going to start to see. And while the carbon dioxide does displace the oxygen, it's right on the cusp of carbon dioxide almost being too dangerous or more dangerous than before you'll notice it on the O2 sensor. Carbon dioxide has an ionization potential, I believe, in the 12 range. So it's not going to show up on our PID meter. I'm right next to a second meter and we're getting different readings. This could be a variety of things. My first question is, are my readings drastically different enough to change my operations? If firefighter A is getting 5 parts per million, firefighter B is getting 10 parts per million, that doesn't really concern me. If firefighter A is getting 50 parts per million, and firefighter B is getting 200 parts per million, then yes, I think there's probably an issue. So what would I do? Well, get a third meter in there, take those 2 meters out, fresh air cal, bring them back in and see how we look. I'm not going to go this slide because we don't need to. I want to do that. So if you guys want the Draeger has some good apps out there. If you just Google Draeger in your iPhone or Android store, they actually do have some good options for training, information, if you're looking to expand on this. And then the Wiser, the NIOSH have some good apps as well. All right, so that's it for the PowerPoint. Does anyone have any questions that they wanted to run by me on anything I did or did not cover? Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just go through the meters quickly. So I'm just going to change this camera around.